Hello, and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. Sarita Srivastava, and we're talking about her book, Are You Calling Me a Racist? And she is the Dean at the Ontario College of Art and Design for Liberal Arts and Sciences and Interdisciplinary Studies. Dr. Srivastava, wonderful to have you on today.
Thank you so much.
Tell me, why this book? What led you, first off, great title, immediately grabbed my interest. Are you calling me a racist? Hilarious. Um, why this book? Why did you feel the need to write this? I think in our current cultural climate, like the need for it is obvious, but I would love to hear kind of how this project came about.
So was an activist many years ago, working in the environmental movement, and there, and actually every organization I've worked in, whether it's universities, whether it's community organizations, for many years, the question always comes up: what do we do about racism, anti-racism, equity, diversity? And the answer for many years across all those organizations and across all those spaces is we need an anti-racist workshop. We need to educate ourselves. We need to talk about it more. We need to get together. We need to hire a facilitator. We need to write a policy. And to my surprise, that answer hasn't changed very much for a long time. And in fact, in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, that's interest in this topic revived again. We had a wave of interest in anti-racism and racism again. Once again, this became the go-to strategy for organizations. What can we do about this problem? And often it's call in a facilitator. Let's have an anti-racist workshop. And what I learned in my research, what I saw, what I observed, starting out, is that these aren't really very effective practices. So I saw that first as an activist. I saw that first, that what actually happens in those organizations, in those moments, in those workshops, is people get defensive. They say, "Are you calling me a racist?" So that's a line. I didn't make that up. That's a line from the interviews. It's a common kind of reaction. It could be, you can say it in so many tones of voices. You could say it in a really sad, upset, hurt voice. You could say it in a really angry, defensive voice. But it's always about the individual reaction, individual response. And that, when I heard and saw the kinds of things that were happening in anti-racist workshops and in organizations, the the inability to actually make a difference or to make a change, I wanted to understand the reasons behind it. Why is it that in organizations where people are there because they believe in making a difference, because they believe in making the world a better place, because they're progressive, they believe in justice, social justice, environmental justice, and so on, or because they believe in education and schools, universities, places where people feel that they're good people, they're there to do good. Why is it in those places that it's so difficult still to make change on these questions of equity, diversity, anti-racism, whatever word you want to use? And the book is focused on the dynamics around race and anti-racism, but much of the analysis and the practices apply to diversity in general, whether we're talking about race or gender or sexuality and ability and so on, the kinds of practices that organizations are trying to do. That so often the answer is, well, we have to look at ourselves as individuals. There's a problem with us. We have to learn more. We have to feel differently. We have to, and so on, as individuals, look inside ourselves, teach ourselves more, or that there's a moral flaw. So it's either learn more or that there's something wrong with how we feel, so it's a personal. It's always comes back to the individual. That there's that racism, for example, is a personal trait, a personal failing. A place of evil, even you're a bad person, or that you just don't know enough, you're ignorant. So there's only the two positions that people go to as they're thinking about what racism means. Often it's a go-to way of thinking about racism. It's a personal trait, personal failing. It's because of ignorance or because of a moral failing. So either you don't know enough and therefore you're ignorant, or if you know better, then you're an evil person. And there's very few other positions available for thinking about this when you talk about individuals. When you shift to thinking about or racism in a different way, in a systemic way, in an organizational way, in the sense of that it's produced by practices and historical practices, then the answer to it would be different. So that's what my book is about, is analyzing how did we get here? Why is it that we continue to use the same strategies? There's a few different answers to that. I only provide one or two answers. I think you could write another book about some of the reasons people remain invested in these strategies. But what I look at is the history of how it is that we think about race in moral terms, for example. How is it we think about um, prejudice and the importance of contact and knowledge about the other as a solution? How we think about, in general, progress through rationality and that we have to, if we just know more, if we reason better, if we have more knowledge, that therefore we would inevitably change, when in fact the answer may be quite different in terms of how we need to change our practices, our organizations, our schools, our corporations. So there are other reasons why people remain interested and invested in those strategies, because they're easy to call in someone, pay someone, they look like they're effective, and so on. So that's not so much the focus of my analysis in this book. um, it's more about how it is that particularly in places such as social movements, community organizations, schools, we have this history of a certain kind of way of solving problems, a certain way of thinking about ourselves in moral terms, in terms of moral identity, for example, a certain way of thinking about emotions and the therapeutic as a way of getting to problems. So, if we talk about our feelings, if we talk about ourselves, if we talk to each other, if we, it's that his political foundation of the personal is political, for example, that we should link our personal experiences and our feelings to our practical and political actions, which is a good sentiment, but it's evolved into something that where we focus more on, where we begin with the experience and stop with the experience, begin with the individual, end with the individual, so often. So your question was why this book and how did you get here? Is I was very um, motivated as someone sitting in those anti-racist workshops, and seeing the denial, seeing people say, "Talk about your experiences of racism," and having to share them, put on the spot, feel very vulnerable, and then having people deny them or say, "Oh, that's just like the same as my experience as being an American going to Canada," or if that's sort of diminishing or denying, or you probably misunderstood that person, that they weren't being racist, or this sort of the desire um, to in a sense, I think it is the desire to absolve.
Mm.
Someone tells a story of racism, somehow there's an implication of guilt to the people listening. And so there's all those dynamics that I saw. I realized this is not an effective strategy. And I really wanted to, because I'm a sociologist, I didn't want to just say, do something different. I wanted to understand, why are these practices so tenacious? Like, if it's clear that they don't work, because there's research that shows they don't work. Like, I don't do that kind of research, but there are people that measure what is the attitudinal change when people go into an anti-racist workshop or an equity workshop that they're required to take by their organizations, a mandatory thing? What were their attitudes before they went in, and what were their attitudes afterwards? And we can see that sometimes there's short-term attitude change, but they don't last. There's no change in the organization. In fact, there's research that shows sometimes it's worse, because what happens if you go to a workshop, a diversity workshop, you kind of become emboldened. You're like, I'm one of those progressive people. So obviously, when I decide not to interview that person, it's obviously not because I'm sexist or racist, because I'm training and I am a progressive person. So, in fact, I mean, and I'm not making this up. This is based on research that measures and assesses these kinds of things. So, and we certainly see, like, there's those. I'm sure you're familiar with those studies that where they send CVs and put different names on them. And it's been repeated in a few different countries over decades, repeatedly, to show that certain CVs with white sounding names are favored with the exact same qualifications. So we know that the practices of discrimination, continue in organizations, whether it's hiring, whether it's thinking about the curriculum, and so on. Those things, the problems still exist, and yet we've been doing this stuff over and over and over again. So the question I have is that prompted me to write the book is, why do we keep doing that? So I wanted to go a little bit deeper into that area.
Mm. I wanted to add another, like you said, there's a lot of different ways to say, "Are you calling me a racist?" There's another one. There's the questioning one. The wait, are you calling me a racist? It's so. I
Yes.
mean, I knew you hadn't come up with it. I obviously, like when you said it's something you heard many times. It's something I've heard many times. That's what I love about the title is I think that's a very common experience. People have heard that in conversation or seen it on a podcast or see, whenever this topic comes up. And when we talked earlier, one of the things that I have appreciated about having people like Dr. Michael Sawyer on, Dr. Lewis Gordon, and even the way that you've approached this is it's very freeing. I don't feel that same tension. I don't feel and I think that's part of what you're getting at is that a lot of this stuff carries with it like, no, you don't get to learn anything until you admit that you're wrong, right? Like the guilt is assumed, and it's a very personal guilt, right? You've made that point a couple times, and this whole what happens is we don't move forward because people are immediately they immediately look for flaws and, well, this is your experience of racism. It's like, well, I've never said that, right? Or I've never done that. So that immediately stuck out to me.
Or they look for reasons why that person would have done that. If I tell a story to you about racism, you then immediately look for explanations, like, that person was really old, that person was really mean, that person was really ignorant, that person, there must be they must be an exception, right? And so when you just said just now something like, you have to admit your guilt before you can, it's the problem is not that there's some guilty people that have to admit their guilt, and that then there's some innocent people that don't have to. It's that the problem is that we're focusing on the individual as the site of guilt. It's not like some people aren't better than others. Like, I'm not saying that some people haven't done more anti-racist work and that we shouldn't commend them for that work, and that some people are really committed to racism and being racist. Like, of course we have a spectrum of that, but that's not where how we're going to make change, by trying to find, like, get a score of how
Right.
individually anti-racist or racist some individual is. That's actually not going to change institutions and everyday practices in the places that we work. So my focus is not on just racism in general. It's in the places where people are actually working in organizations and places where they want to make a difference. So of course there's places where people don't want to challenge racism and are committed to racism. That's not what my book is about. So that's a different category. It's where so the issue is not then that we all say, well, everybody's innocent. It's actually we're all rather participating in historically in systems that are based on histories of colonialism, slavery, and racism. Like that, those are that culture, those practices. We inhabit all of them. That's including me. So it's not to say that therefore, that any individual person is free of that, but that neither do we all have to then go, before we can do the work, actually feel the guilt and feel terrible about it. Like, in other words, there's often this I don't know, notion or compulsion that people have to demonstrate their guilt in order to be seen as innocent. And that actually is something I've written about in relationship to criminal justice as well, right? So the people who are innocent and they're wrongfully accused, because they don't show remorse, right? Because they're actually not guilty, they are punished more
Mm,
harshly. Like, it's harder for them to get parole and so on, because they're not showing the emotion of remorse. And so, in order to be absolved, you're supposed to show the emotion of remorse and guilt and so on. And so that's the kind of emotional moral. That's how the emotions and the moral are so, I think it's a good example to demonstrate how the emotional and moral are so tightly linked, and integrally linked. And the same is the case with racism as well. Is that you have to, there are particular emotional demonstrations of guilt and innocence, that are important and that become important in these spaces and conversations. And again, it's all about the individual. It's all about the, um, therapeutic mode of how do we make change, rather than a political or systemic or organizational or very practical, way of making change, in our organizations.
Uh, Thank you. And that makes sense to me. I think I might have misspoke earlier, so I appreciate you clearing that up. And I think a great example is when you start your book off with when you talk about focusing too much on the individual when there are very clear systemic things at play, and you start off with Meghan Markle being like, "I can't believe that the royal family has these racist tendencies. It must just be because they're old, or because um,
Yeah, or yeah.
uh,
That's a good example, yeah. Actually, my publisher, my editor had said to me, "You should write about Meghan and Harry." And I was like, "Well, I don't have anything. I'm not really into the royal family. I don't have anything to say about them. Popular culture, not that interesting. I don't really follow it." And then I started thinking about it, and I looked at that example, and I thought, this is a perfect demonstration of how it is that people think about racism as about the individual, because they said that, did that interview with Oprah. They said, when their baby was, before their baby was born, someone said, "Well, what's the baby going to look like?" And she says, that Megan says to Oprah, the implication was that if the baby would be brown or not white, that would be bad. And she says, which is really hard to understand, right? She says to Oprah. And of course, like, your first reaction is, "Oh my gosh, that's terrible." The royal family, like, and then you're like, well, obviously, of course, if you think of the history of the British royal family in Britain and their history and the relationship to colonialism and slavery, like, their whole practice, job, mission, accomplishment has been to prop up colonialism and slavery why would you be surprised that there is some legacy of thinking that white is better than the other colors? And so I write about how it is that, but at that time there was, people who were outraged, right, that they would, call the royal family racist and point the finger at anyone in the royal family, and defended the royal family, right, thinking that this is about defending those individuals. As like, are you calling the queen racist? Kind of like essentially the title of my book. Like, how could it be that people who are upstanding and aristocratic, um, leaders, how could they actually be also so petty and racist? And that to me is an example, a route to demonstrating that actually it's not about any particular individual or not. It's actually about, it's actually about the history of a particular, um, family legacy of British colonialism and racism that, of course, come out in these conversations about who is a prince going to marry, who is a royal member of the family going to marry, what does a royal family line look like. I mean, it's actually astonishing that they that racism, or, wasn't actually more present at the time that they were married. It wasn't more explicit. What I described in that chapter was, to think about how astonishing it. What actually is astonishing is that Megan could have been unaware, as someone who walked down the aisle in a gown embroidered with the 57 flowers of all the Commonwealth countries that Britain ruled. And then to say, how could it be that they would not, that they would be, express discomfort at one of those colonized countries entering into their line. So that to me is, encapsulates some of the way I think of that. I think we need to shift our thinking about, racism in general. If you wanted to shift that way of thinking in the royal family, it wouldn't be to go and talk to those individuals, right? It would be to actually think about, what does it mean to be British? today, for example? What does it mean to be a British citizen? What is Britain as a nation? Um, and to ask questions about the historical legacies and the culture, and what is it that we honor in our countries, for example. At the same time as that, as she was asking those questions, people were pulling down statues of slave traders in Britain, for example, and all around the world. So it's that kind of shift in thinking that we need and practice.
Yes, as we kind of look at this, I'm looking at your book, these 54 flowers that are on there. That's a perfect example. That was the one that I really stuck out to me as you're talking about the individual versus kind of systemic, because, and again, I'm imagining here, but I can't see how you couldn't imagine this. That Megan probably thought that was cute or lovely, historical, right? Like this, it's traditional, and she's taking this step back. She's able to create this distance between what they actually symbolize and just the grandeur of it. And so when racism comes up, it's that individual, that kind of ugly thing going on there. But she's not seeing what she's not following through on what the 54 flowers mean, right? Um,
No, we never do. We always think, oh, that's historical. That happened a long time ago. And therefore, it has nothing to do with the way we think or what we do today. We see this all the time. People are really annoyed when the history of slavery, the history of colonialism, is brought up in any way to have implications for the present. But if you think about it, how could something that, on which our economic system was based, and trade was based for so long, not have an impact on our culture today, not have an impact on social systems and practices today? How could it not have an impact on where people live and how we think about each other? How could it not have an impact on the subjects that we teach in school? It's kind of astonishing to imagine that it wouldn't. In fact, that's the work that we're doing still. We think about curriculum in schools when we think about what counts as art, and what counts as what are the stories we tell about the history, and how anything really, who we honor. Those things are still based on who wrote those history books, and who was at the center of who was in power when those histories were written about, and so on. It's very straightforward if you think about it. But what we do is we live day to day life thinking that those things are in the past, that we are our own people, and we are free of those histories, and that culture. And so it's really that disjuncture. It's not just Megan that does that. We all do it. We're all shocked. I mean, I am too when someone says something racist. I'm also shocked when someone calls me a racist. I mean, it's not as if I'm like immune from any of this. That's why I'm able to write about it. That's not going to go away, our emotional reactions, but that's why we need to pause and think, where do those emotional reactions come from? How do we shift them? And how do we actually make a difference if we want things to change?
Race and class have always been tied in together. So another good one, when we're talking about history, is the leisure time necessary to get educated enough to write history and to actually write the history. It takes a lot of time, and it's not like people become rich doing those things. Like, it does happen, but it's pretty rare. Like, and
Yeah.
so when we talk about these sources, it's always going to be the upper middle class and higher that are going to have the biggest voice because they have the time to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had Matt Garcia on to talk about the food industry, and he was talking about, yeah, for him, it's the untold history of food farming in Mexican American communities. And one of the things that, as you're talking about these systemic things, I always grew up seeing agricultural work as unskilled, low paid labor. But when you look at husbandry, when you look at agricultural work, there's a lot of, not like, I'm trying to grow a garden out back and I do digital marketing, which is a highly valued skill. I get paid a lot of money for it. And gardening is just as complicated, if not more so, than I'm bad at it. Like, than digital marketing. But if you look at the history of it, starting with the African American community, the slave trade, and then you can actually trace what happens with emancipation, and then all of a sudden there's an influx of Chinese workers, and then you could trace the low wages to very clear and specific minority communities that are brought over to do those things. And that's
Mm.
why, and I mean, you talk to anybody, it's like, how much should you be paid to mow a lawn? And everyone's going to say it's like way, like, you still have to know things about grass and stuff to do it right. Like, we have a lawn service here. It's Florida. I'm not ashamed to say it. It is too hot. I talked to my parents about it. I was like, this is what I make. And this is, but they know so much about what they're doing. And I have no idea. But it's one of those like clear systemic things. Do you have any, as you talk about these diversity days inside these organizations, what are some of the practices that you see that kind of enable these kind of systemic things? You know, we've talked about the royal family. That one's particularly egregious, and it's going to be really hard to get them to admit that that's systemic, because that seems like then they kind of stop being the royal family. But I don't know. Yeah, it'd be hard. Like, there's the, anyways,
No, don't you? But you forget that some people embrace those
mm,
histories, right? There's people that think that those histories are valuable and those practices continue to be valuable, and that those disparities are continue to be important, and that colonialism was that they would prop up and support and value the histories of what colonialism have brought us. So it's not. I don't think that we would agree on that. They would necessarily agree, even if they realized that it was systemic. That they would agree that it had to be undone.
well, that's the quote that you have from the Queen about, it's a shame the African countries can't govern themselves. It was so much better when we took care of them. And it's just that's just an individual. She's just, there's no figurehead status there at all, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah. No, the diversity days are interesting. Again, it's an example of so Jane Ward has a book, which the name of which is escaping me right now, but she has a book in which she studies queer organizations, community organizations in California who are like nationally known, and one of them nationally known for their diversity uh, projects and policies and so on, how they're held up as an organization that does really good work. And one of the things, so she went in to interview people in that organization. And what she found is that all the work that they do, the diversity days, the diversity policy, and so on, for the people inside the organization, the people of color inside the organization, actually, all that did was reinforce that the organization is normatively white at its center. In other words, if you have to keep saying, hey, we have diversity days, hey, we're so diverse, I mean, who's saying that? If you think about it for a second, obviously, I mean, it's not somebody like me that's like, "Hey, isn't it cool how diverse we are?" It's the people who feel that they need to who feel they need to demonstrate the diversity because the organization desperately needs diversity days and diversity policies and so on in order to counterbalance the fact that it's not that been that diverse. But it's not just about diverse, because diversity just means there's a lot of different kinds of things. What they're saying is like what's really at the center of this organization in terms of its culture, in terms of its values, in terms of its history, in terms of who's in charge, in terms of whatever measures you want to use, who it serves, and so on. That really hasn't changed. And all that happens when you go diversity day, diversity policy, diversity project, diversity program, is that for them, this is from her research, that those folks, the people who were actually working in there that were marginalized or that were, not at the center or that were traditionally not at the center, all it did for them is to not to make them feel more included or to make the place feel more diverse or equitable to them, but actually just to reinforce the fact that it's not. And so it really had actually the opposite effect, as often it does, that these programs and projects often have the opposite of the intended effect. So that's so not only are they not ineffective, sometimes they make things worse, and there certainly aren't improving. The things that really need to be worked on, which aren't as, let's say, public or obvious, right? Sometimes they can be very boring things. Sometimes it can be just, changing a hiring practice, collecting some data, things like that, that you can't go, hey, we have this big celebration, come and eat some food, come and eat some food from different places. That kind of thing that's like fun and celebratory and like very much of a public thing to do. One of the examples I give in the book, and maybe we spoke about this when we talked earlier, is the very well-known example of two men that walk into a cafe for a business meeting with a friend, with a colleague. And so they are approached by the person who works there, the manager, whomever, to say, you haven't ordered anything. You have to order something. And they say, we're waiting for someone. And by the time their business colleague gets there, they're in handcuffs. They've been arrested
Hmm.
for being in the cafe not ordering anything. So that moment in Philadelphia was, of course, went on social media. Someone filmed it, and that cafe was Starbucks. And so, because it was Starbucks, they were under scrutiny for this moment of racism. And this was, I've forgotten the year now, 2019,
I think I
perhaps.
saw this. Yeah, I saw when it went in the news, but I don't remember the timing.
Yeah, it was huge.
Yeah.
It's huge, because someone in the cafe while it was happening, while the men were being arrested. So everybody saw it, because when you hear that, it's just like at the beginning of the conversation, you think, "Oh, that can't. There must have been there must be some
Right, right.
explanation. They must have been really rude. They must have like hit the manager. Something must have happened." Well, someone was there, filmed the whole thing to see that all they said was, "We're not ordering," because we're waiting. And the person called the police. Then the police came. You think the police would go, well, they're just sitting there. They haven't ordered. They're waiting. No, the police decide to arrest them. So the guy, there's two black men. Obviously, don't have to tell that part of the story. And the colleague arrives who's white, and Starbucks is embarrassed. So what do you think Starbucks does in response to this?
Well, they have to do some kind of, I mean, this is actually something I wrote down. You said they do it because it's easy. It's also, like you said, it's not exciting to change a hiring practice, but man, it is great publicity to have some kind of diversity workshop, some kind of diversity training. You can take pictures, and if anyone questions you, you can point to it, right? I don't know exactly what did they do?
And also because people believe in it. Well, they spent $12 million to shut down all the Starbucks for one afternoon to have a diversity workshop for all their employees. And they had a company or someone, I assume, make like videos, and they were on iPads. And I mean, I wasn't there, but the employees watched the iPads, they watched the videos, they watched the educational thing for one afternoon. They learned about racism. So, I mean, if you think about, I mean, I always think about this incident because it really demonstrates in such a scale the cost of the diversity industry, the limited impact, right? We're talking about one afternoon. So would one afternoon have altered if that person, if we think in the terms of the timeline, that one afternoon of anti-racist training happened before those two men came into the cafe, would that person have thought differently, or would that person have not connected at all in their mind racism with those guys better order coffee? They're supposed to order coffee. Why are they sitting? And that emotional response to whatever that person thought about them, how dare they, that they're all that history of they're thinking about what those people represent, the danger they represent, whatever thinking, that racist thinking that person has, is that going to be undone by maybe the year before or 2 years earlier they sat in front of an iPad for a couple of hours? I mean,
Yeah. So there is, if you don't mind, because we've talked quite a bit about how it's systemic versus individual. And I think this goes to what you said earlier, that you're not writing about the committed racist, right? For the committed racist, yes, there is a systemic side, but that is a individual moral failing.
it's a good question because I don't write about that. I don't know how I would, I'm not sure that would go to that place
Okay.
either. actually. I'm a
Right,
sociologist,
right, right, right,
so I'm
right.
never going to go to that place.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was
You
thinking,
can't get me
well,
there.
because I'm thinking through this because because I have been in a diversity, like we had, I taught at a school that will remain nameless, and they had a racially charged incident that actually had nothing to do with the school, it had to do with some of the students during summertime, and all the teachers had to do a diversity workday. And the prevailing attitude was, why am I being punished for this?
For the one failing of one
Yes,
person.
for the feeling of like, and of course it was like, well, we could go more into like what I don't want to like throw stones. It's a
Give too
good
much
example, but
detail.
it's definitely where. But that's as we're talking about this with these. That's what I would imagine most Starbucks workers are thinking when they get pulled into sit and look at the iPads.
Mm.
I wouldn't say all of them, right? But I've been in that situation before, and I know that had to be at least some of the feeling.
I mean, it's possible, but I also wouldn't buy that argument that if, one of those other thousands of workers that were forced to sit in the workshop wouldn't have done the same thing if they were confronted with that
Oh,
situation. Because we see that all the time, right? We only hear about the few examples where someone decides to call the police on a bird watcher. Like we hear about those, but that
yeah.
happens every day, some version
I'm
of
not
that.
arguing for that.
So,
Let me be clear. Oh,
yeah.
okay. I was just talking about how they're going to why it doesn't work. I'm talking about why
Yeah,
they've.
yeah, I
Yeah,
see what
yeah.
you're
I'm
saying.
sorry. I'm not saying. I wasn't.
Well, no, but you said like the people who are the committed I think we started out with you
Yes.
said, but the people who are the committed racists, that's there's some individual moral failing. Is that what or did I misunderstand what you said?
That was kind of an aside thing. I apologize. I could see where the confusion came in. I wanted to
Well,
see.
now I'm curious. Now I'm curious though. Were you saying that as kind of as devil's advocate, or were you saying it as in a kind of a sarcastic way? Or were you saying I think actually there's cases in which people are just like really bad people because committed to being racist.
I I do think that people who are committed to being racist, who enjoy that sort of thing, not committed to the systems or that sort of thing. I think the sort of person who and but maybe the moral failing is that they enjoy cruelty and that racism is an expression of that.
I mean, let's not talk about people who are pathologically, outside the spectrum of, you know, human compassion. It's a different
Right, right.
thing.
Well, that's why I'm like maybe what I'm as I'm thinking of examples of like that committed racist, like it
Yeah.
often seems to be someone who is allowed by the system to express things that are moral failings, but they probably would have found a different way to express it that would work inside the system. So maybe it's not. Anyways, does that?
It's a really interesting conversation because it's not something I think about that often because I think more in sociological terms. So, in terms of patterns and culture and history. So, those few individuals who are extreme, let's put them aside because I think there's people that are, extremely violent and extremely antisocial and psychopath and sociopaths or whatever.
Yes.
Like, there's that I can't, that is so outside of my expertise. I'd rather just
Yeah,
put that
yeah. No,
aside.
that's fine. That's fine. And I asked two separate questions. So that's
But there's something in between, which is people who are committed to who believe have racist beliefs and hold racist beliefs, who don't think of themselves as progressive or good people, and who are, in an environment like their family, themselves, their everyone around them thinks that those other people are inferior to them, and really genuinely believes that and has no problem repeating it and so on, and may even act on it, like may even yell things at people on the street or treat people badly in their community because of it, and feel that justified in that I don't think of as an individual moral failing. Still, to me,
okay.
I still think of that cultural and social. And in other words, that is often produced through particular kinds of interest, whether that's economic interest or whether that's, culture, histories of communities not coming together because of the way that slavery created distance between communities and created, an opposition of economic interests and so on. So there's a reason why, communities grew up, feeling, hate towards each other. Let's just call it that. Okay. And why was that hate cultivated culturally? Right. Because there was in a broader cultural interest to think of that group of people as lesser than you. Right. In other words, how do you continue to justify something like slavery unless you also continue to prop up the belief that those people are different than us, right? So how deep is that, and how deep does that run even after those systems may be gone, for example? So that I still think is, you can't then go, oh, that person was bad. It's like, and it had nothing to do with this history, nothing to do with the culture as a whole. I still don't think you can think of those things as just individual moral failings. And one of the things that I find so interesting in this conversation as an example is, do you remember the first it's the first group of high school students that were bused because of desegregation, black high school students that were bused to a white high school in order to further the project of desegregating schools. And when that first group of students was bused, there was parents and students, that harassed those students when they got off the bus, yelled at them, protested. Those students experienced harassment in the school by their fellow high school students, and so on. And recently, I read a story about a man who was one of those students, one of the white students. So you can see him. There's a photo of him, famous photo of him, like yelling at the students when they're getting off the bus. And like he said, I was, hateful and racist towards my classmates. And years and years later, like 40 years later, he realized error of his ways. Let's say he felt remorse about it. He thought about it. He reflected on it, and he reached out to one of his black classmates, to express this, and to connect with her. And they now work together on anti-racist education. So to think about it as an individual moral failing means, again, it's like an individual trait. That person can't be, has to be, it has to be morally redeemed or something, or has to be educated or something. But he was a child. He was a high school student living in a community in which, for whatever reason, people really believed deeply, for historical reasons, that group of people is so different than us that we cannot have them in our schools, and that will somehow damage us. And he grew up believing that can't be an individual moral failing. And so that's, I think even in those cases, we can analyze it differently, and we can also think of other ways to approach this, besides, neither. I mean, there's no one tool that's going to work. But how I often think about it, to go back to the example of desegregation, is if you waited, if the U.S. had waited till all the hearts and minds of everyone had been changed, right, before putting into place, and challenging discriminatory laws, would still would still be there, right? You can't start with this premise that we have to change people one at a time, in terms of their emotions, their feelings, their knowledge, and convince them, before we can move on and make change. There has to be a way in which we look at the practices that need to be changed, which is what happened in this person's case. It's like he grew up in a society which he realized, oh, everything around him has changed. Maybe the way he thought about segregation may have been wrong, because he saw and started to live in a different way. The world changed around him. And so that's in a sense what I'm advocating is, let's look around and think about how can we change the practices in which which we're inhabiting, the organizations which we're inhabiting, rather than changing our hearts and minds inside, in one at a time. Not that there's anything wrong with therapy or reflection; those are all good things. It's only in this one context of organizational change that I'm talking about it.
Couple things. One is that earlier I realized I asked two questions. I did two questions in a row, which is not fair. That's I mentioned the the individual guilt thing, and then I talked about Starbucks, and so those were two separate things in my mind. So I apologize for the confusion there, because that
Yeah,
I was
no,
not
it's
trying to do
okay.
that for Starbucks, as if, well, it's just that one. That's exactly what you're arguing against, which is like just that one person. And I
Yeah.
think you know, as we talk about individual moral failings, do you think, and I understand that we're way off topic here, do you think there are communal moral failings? Because that's how I immediately would think about what you're talking about. And I realize that this is not your area, and that's like so. And it might just be a semantics thing because I agree 100% that desegregation, the best way to do that was a systemic thing, right? You're not gonna, like it's a very solid argument. I don't think anyone thinks that I was in Alabama that happened like that. We were gonna try and go around and like talk to like do therapy with with every student and parent in Alabama. Arkansas. My apologies. Yes.
Yeah. So your question, to go back to your
Yes.
question, are there communal moral failings? Again, I'm a sociologist, so I don't think in terms of
Yes. Yeah.
failings.
Yeah. 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 I understand.
But I do
Yes. Okay.
but I do think in terms of the moral, right? So what I write about in the book is about moral histories
Hmm.
and moral regulation, and moral identity and moral culture. So to me, I think about if you ask me about the moral, I'm going to answer in historical
Yeah.
terms and in systemic terms. So I do think that there are ways that we can make ethical shifts so that we can see that, for example, that abolition, in the movement for abolition of slavery, became more possible when people shifted their notions of sin, for example, right? It's very clearly can demonstrate the people that were involved in the abolitionist movement, Quakers, for example, or any, people who often were religious, tied it to their notions of what was wrong. Well, how this was essentially wrong and a sin. But it's because the way that people began to think about what was wrong and sin as shifted, and that the notions of absolution and redemption also shifted. So I'm not saying that's something we should go back to, because I don't think that way of thinking about racism is going to work for us now, but to say that there is a way in which um, ethical shifts, in other words, collective ethical shifts, collective ways of thinking about morality can help us in thinking about anti-racism. So it's not that I think that I'm against thinking
Yeah.
ethically at all. It's the opposite, is that I think that we need to develop new ethical commitments, new ways of thinking about morality in a collective and communal. You use the word communal, but I would say the collective and cultural and societal ways, however you want. Whether it's our organization that we're talking about, or our society or a community. So rather than saying you're a bad person, you're a racist, you need to make yourself better, reflect inside yourself so that you can improve yourself and become a better anti-racist self, I would say, what's our ethical commitment to anti-racism and diversity? And if we start from that place, then we're much more likely, from the place of values, ethics, ethical practices, to think, and in every moment when we do something, are we acting in equitable ways? If that's our ethical guide, then that would make a difference. But I think that's for each. I don't have a map for people, or like any kind of universal moral guide. That's not what the way I would advocate. But I would advocate that each space, each organization, each community that wants to work on this, reflect on. That's one of the things they should reflect on. First of all, what do we want to change? But secondly, they may want to reflect on what are the values that bring us to answering those questions. How do we answer those questions in ways that reflect our values, and what are our values? Like that, even that work, and it's even that work to ask that question in a collective way, the question that you've just asked, but to reverse it. You asked it, what are the communal moral failings? And I'm turning around and saying in a positive way, what are our communal or collective moral commitments or ethical commitments? That is a useful question to me in terms of getting us to a different place.
One, I don't think we fundamentally disagree. And I think part of this is the disciplinary gap a little bit with like because I
Yep.
everything you're saying I agree with. And so thank you for answering that very charitably, because there was a little, it wasn't bumpy, but it was just like I could tell there was some kind of noise there, and you answered it very well.
No,
Uh,
not at all. No need to apologize. They're great questions. I think disciplinary gaps are so
yeah.
interesting. We don't want to just talk to ourselves. So it's so interesting to see how we could reframe the questions. Same problematic, from different disciplinary angles. Like I'm certainly not going to argue history is better than philosophy or sociology is better than history or anything like that. I draw on all those things in my work.
Well, you're
So
the dean of interdisciplinary studies. Like you have to say that. I mean, yeah. No, I want to be respectful of your time. One, thank you again for coming on. It's been really awesome. So, what are some tools? I've really appreciated your emphasis on the complexity of this because as you talk about this, people do want like, well, if it's not diversity days, what is the silver bullet? And so I want to avoid that question, but I do want to ask, what are some tools that we can have to better analyze our systemic practices and come up with solutions for ourselves that work better? Are there sets of tools, like analytical tools, that allow us to create um, rather than just having great publicity?
yeah, absolutely. So the last chapter of my book asked this question, like, so what can we do differently? So if not that, then what? Essentially, and I came up with an acronym because it makes things easier to remember, which is ACT.
There you go.
The acronym is ACT, and it stands for the A stands for ask. So ask what is it that we, where is it that where are the places that we can act? In fact, I'm going to open my book so I don't get it.
No worries.
What is it that I say the ACT stands for? I don't want to get the A wrong, but I'm going to have to get my glasses on. So the last chapter is called Why is Anti-Racism Elusive? And Try This Instead. So what can we do? Act for change. So the ACT stands for ask, collaborate, and take action. So the first one is to ask questions and analyze. That's the A. So in other words, how did we get here in the first place? What are the, whatever problematic that we have, how did we get here? What's the root of this problem? How big a problem is it? What are the practices that contribute to this problem? Let's say it's, we're a service, we're a community service, and only a certain part of our community comes in and uses our service. Why is that? Why is it the same people? Why is it the same middle class white people, for example? Where are I mean, we know we have a big immigrant community here, they never come in. What's going on? So maybe so just even identifying that problem, how is it that we got here? What's the problem? How big is it? Let's do some, data and see, is this actually a problem? The second is C, collaborate and craft solutions, and a vision for how we'd want it to be different. I guess that's kind of the backwards way of saying it. It's like, what do we want to be different? And then crafting together collectively some actual solutions that we could think about that might work. How would we want it to look different? And then the third is the T, take one small action now. So
Hmm.
I think it's often like people think of, anti-racism as, that's why the workshops I think are appealing, because they speak on the largest possible stage, right? They talk about the history of racism and convince people that racism is a problem, and what percentage of CEOs are Black, and so on. They really like paint a picture and convince people it's a problem, but it never gets to the sort of very ordinary, and people don't often. Again, that's not something that's very often a very attractive thing to think about, appealing thing to think about, because people don't think, oh well, what could that small thing do? But it's so much more effective to do that one small thing. And that's one small thing could be, again, it could be simply, let's collect data on, maybe that's our one small thing. Let's figure out what percentage of our students are from this community. Let's figure out, let's collect data on how many people buy our products. That's a very small thing. Or let's change the questions on our interviews. Let's change one thing about our interview practice. Let's interview, three people that aren't as qualified as the other people, and get them into the pool. Like, it could be a very small action that's not you can't put on your annual report in the same way that we did this diversity day. It could be anything, but it's the action part of it. It's the concrete practices rather than the therapeutic or the moral or the abstract knowledge, as the goal of the practice, or as the goal of the action. So that's my answer. And I think it's very general because it's going to look different for each organization. Each organization actually can only do it themselves by looking at their own practices, what's going on, what's going wrong. I'll give you one example of how this works, which is one of the two of the women that I interviewed were working in a community organization, and they said that there was these accusations of racism, and so the response of the organization was to call in a big name anti-racist consultant facilitator, and they would sit around talking about their feelings and their relationships and how what you said hurt me, and then the person would try to facilitate, and the two women in the collective, it was a collective, ran as a collective, said, screw this. We don't want to sit around and keep watching people crying and talking about people's feelings and so on. What we want to do, so what they did instead was they decided to collect data on analyzing the division of labor in the collective. Who did what? It's supposed to be a collective, so it's supposed to be equal. The division of labor is supposed to be equal. Instead, what they found was that the white women in the collective did the management style work. They wrote the grant proposals and so on. And the women of color went to the post office and did cleaning the kitchen or organizing the snacks and so on. And they demonstrated through a very practical way and practical analysis of labor, of the division of labor practices, that there was an equity that was racialized, which is very different than let's sit around and talk about how what you said made me feel, and how can we repair our relationship and facilitate. So this conflict resolution therapeutic approach that so often gets used doesn't actually change anything that's actually happening day to day.
Do you mind if I try an example? And I, as you're talking, I'm thinking about, you have colleges, for instance, where they'll say we're not getting, we're not very diverse, and it could be something as simple as, oh, we go to college days, and that's the bulk of our recruiting. And so they go where, and the people who are most likely to go to college days are this class of people, or this, this kind of racialized division. So even if it's just something as simple as, and that's not anyone's particular, like, I like that example because there's no individual guilt to that. It's like, well, what do you do as a recruiter? You go to college days, right? It's not like someone's like, oh, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to not recruit, minorities, persons of color. And so instead they go and they do the college days, but then they add something where they could go to a community of color and do figure out a different way to recruit somewhere else. Would that be another example as well?
Yeah. Instead of saying, well, let's send all our recruitment staff to diversity
Yeah,
training.
yeah. That wouldn't do anything.
So that
Yeah.
OB standard thing, like it must be those people, or maybe just let's send our senior leadership in the university to diversity training, or let's write a diversity policy, you know, or even if we said, yeah, let's write a policy that says we are committed to diversity. We are committed to diversity in recruitment, and we are committed to diversity of bringing in more people. Like, those are all things that universities do. There's nothing wrong with those, writing that policies. But what we need to back it up with then is some analysis, like some evidence-based analysis, so that A, in my ACT framework, is ask questions like, how did we get here? So if only certain numbers of students are coming, certain kinds of students, why is that? How did we get to that
Yeah.
place? Well, probably it's something to do with, like, way before the recruitment process. It's probably at the time of high school when students are thinking about, what do I want to do, with my life? Would I go to university? Well, nobody in my family ever did. And would never occur to me to apply to an Ivy League, et cetera, et cetera. Like, who's encouraging those students? Who's supporting them? What kind of support do they have in their families if they don't have a history in their families of doing that, opposed to the families where everyone in their family went to Princeton. And so, they know someone there, they know how to get into there, et cetera. They know what the people who admissions look at admissions, all of that. So there's so many places that we could act to get students into universities that don't have that support, and don't even think of themselves and don't even see themselves
Hmm.
there. And so that would be what I don't know the
Right,
answer.
because you'd have to see
You
the
know,
individual college. Right.
So the answer, but that will be where you would start, is like, how is it that this problem comes to exist? And then where are the places that, and then again, together think about what would it, how do we like it to look different? And then what would be the places that we'd have to act in order for that to be different? And then take one small action. So my one small action might be, you know what, this local high school which is close to us, where it wouldn't be too expensive for students to think about coming to us. It's not too hard for us to support students from there. We're going to go in there and we're going to talk to those students every year, but we're going to talk to them in grade 9. We're not going to talk, and then we're going to go back and we're going to actually in grade 10, we're going to bring them to campus to come and listen to a lecture. Like I did this when I was in high
Yeah.
school, where it was a thing where, and it wasn't because they were necessarily trying to target my community. And everyone went to university in my high school, but it was a thing where it was professors did lectures that were for high school students, and we did it all together. We went down, and I think it was because I took Latin and I was into the classics, and there was all the classics professors. That's my memory now. So all the Latin students went down to University of Toronto, and it was cool. We got to sit in lecture auditoriums and listen to university professors. So this is not a example of them doing something that I'm talking about, but to say how much of an impact that made on me. Even though my father was a university professor, I'd never sat in a university lecture and listened to a professor. So even in my family, which it wasn't so weird for me to think about university, even there, I really had no connection. So to think about what are the ways that we can connect those students to make them feel and see themselves in that place. So there's many ways in which places that we could act. Is what all I'm saying. And it's not, and that one small action to say, oh, we're going to go in grade 10 or 11, and we're going to, maybe it'll be a scholarship, maybe it'll be a program, maybe it'll be invite everyone down for one lecture to say, not just to convince them to come to university, but just to give them some excitement about, hey, this place is not a place it's a place where you belong. You could imagine yourself there, and to make it a positive experience. I do that with my kids. That's why since they've been little, I take them to the art gallery, to other kinds of cultural institutions, like the ballet, or, think places I was never taken when I was a child, because I want them not to think, oh, that's for other people. Other people do that. It's like, no, it's an ordinary place that anyone can go and have an interesting time, and you find your thing that you're interested in. It's not a high culture thing for, rich people. And that's the kind of, I think, practice that we could do with anything where we're thinking, why aren't people here? It's like, well, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Actually, instead of going, come to our place.
Well, and what I love about ending with that, take one small action, and I think this has kind of been the thrust of your message this whole time, is that, I mean, the diversity policy is fine, but if you have this change in like having people go in and do this 9th, 10th, you will see a difference with or without the diversity policy. But if you have just the diversity policy and you don't have a small action, you're just going to have something that's great for publicity, but it's not actually, it's going to be very similar to the diversity days, right? Where it's like, it's this kind of salvation message where it's like, pay us $12 million and with our iPads, we'll change people's worldviews. Like there'll be great rejoicing in our anti-racism evangelism. Yeah.
The bad news is this one small action, you can't stop there.
Yeah.
So let's say, for example, you get all those students in, then you can't just, again, rest on your diversity policy. We treat all students the same. And we have a policy that says if anyone gets, I'm laughing because that's how it is. I mean, I work at a university. It's not like any universities that, is doing anything profoundly different. And I don't hold myself up as, as an alternative. But to say this is the thing where all universities are struggling with, is students, your universities that do become diverse racially and ethnically, for example, also struggle, because then that actually increases the incidences of racism, right? Those students on campus experience racism. They feel marginalized. It's like it's not enough just to get students in the door. Then you have to continue taking those actions to think about, how do we support those students, not waiting until incidents happen and they feel discriminated against and say, well, we have a discrimination policy to deal with that. But actually, what are you doing and thinking of in terms of thinking about the culture on campus and the backlash, towards those students from the majority students and so on? Like this is this is not a problem I'm making.
No.
Right. This is what happens on campuses.
Would that be another take one small action, or would you start over kind of asking again once people are on campus, ask, collaborate, and take it's kind of like,
Yeah, I think you'd have to take each problem. You'd have
yeah,
to say, I mean, it depends on how big your approach is, right? But if you're saying right now, the problem is now we've got a campus that's diverse. So now how do we deal with the fact of diversity? In terms of how do we create a culture that is welcoming for everyone, a culture in which people are not in silos, or if they are in silos, it's because they feel that's where they feel most comfortable, and etc. Like what's the way in which we can um, decrease those instances of hostility, hate, etc., and polarization that happen on campuses that we see when campuses when people who are not historically there start entering those campuses. So that would be to me a new problematic where we say, okay, so now how do we think about this? How do we take one small action on this rather than to take the whole thing and go, racism is a problem, we have to solve it. Let's take these very sort of global universal actions, which can be useful too. Like let's make the big statements, let's make the big value statements. Those are useful too. But sometimes looking at the concrete practices, like what do we do when students come on campus? How do we welcome them? What happens when they first arrive? What happens in their first year? And so to me, the if the problem is student life, then the ask part of it is what actually is the problem? Oh, well, actually, we get students in the door, but we don't retain them after first year. They all leave. We have a really poor retention of students of color after the second, or Indigenous students. They leave. You know, so you got them in the door, but so
yeah.
that you have the asking part of the analyzing part is really important. You have to ask what is actually the problem, right? Now it's not recruiting, now it's
And you have
retention.
to ask
um,
why. Is it a lack of funding? Is it is it because it's
yes,
unwelcoming? It could be all
exactly.
sorts of different things. Yeah.
Exactly, that's right. So it's like I think a lot of our solutions are based on an assumption of what the problem is, which is the individual, personal trait, moral
Right.
failing,
Right.
etc. When we continue to do that in other cases, like, oh, I know, but we don't actually, if it's not evidence based, we don't analyzing, we actually don't know what's going on for students. And sometimes it is actually the lack of being able to retain students in university often is because of funding, right? They just can't keep up working part time and going to school, which other students who have money don't have to do. So there's all kinds of reasons. It's not just, oh, they perceived a racist environment when they came into the school. So sometimes a one small action could be something very simple, like have a bursary in second year
Hmm.
for students. It doesn't have to be like, okay, do anti-racist training now for all the second year students.
Uh-oh. Dr. Srivastava, it has been an absolute joy having you on. I love the way that ended. I love the way that it got so practical. Um, I love that your first step is to ask and listen, and I think that we could do like that's never a bad, never a bad takeaway. So thank you again for coming on.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate all your work in asking and listening to so many scholars. It's really impressive. I appreciate it. And I'm honored to be on your show.
Thank
Thanks.
you.